Hey everyone, welcome back to Fireside Conspiracies. I'm Nick, your host, and tonight we're starting something new, a series I'm calling Cloaked Chronicles. See, sometimes when I'm sitting here by the fire, I can't help but wonder, what if the stories that shaped our childhood weren't just made up? What if they were memories? Old, half-forgotten truths dressed up in dragons, rings, and galaxies far, far away so they could survive when the world decided to stop believing, or when certain tales were no longer politically convenient for the time. If history's written by the winners, then where does the truth take refuge? Just think about how many of what we now call fairy tales started out as stories people genuinely believed were true, or at least carried real-world warnings from history. The Brothers Grimm. They collected tales like Hansel and Gretel from villagers who swore they came from actual events of famine, witches, and lost children in the deep woods. Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid drew from centuries-old folklore that sailors swore by, detailing mermaids who lured ships to their doom. Something similar to the sirens of Homer's Odyssey. A story historians swore was pure myth, till they had to concede that the made-up city of Troy was in fact very real. Even Beauty and the Beast has roots in older French stories told as cautionary accounts of strange noble families, occult practices, and cursed estates. These weren't pulled out of thin air. They were passed down as something that happened and could happen again, until time and skepticism turned them into legends and myths. And with everything happening in the world, wars, cultural upheaval, and a looming sense of an oncoming paradigm shift, it feels like a good time to grab a drink, pull up a seat, and ask the question, what if the stories are true? Ask any of the great authors still with us, and most will tell you they don't fully understand where they get these stories. Oh, parts of them may be inspired by personal experience or observation, but the epics, the books that stay ingrained in our subconscious, those stories seem to go beyond the creativity of their authors, and that's not just my opinion. The greats admit that at certain points, they channel something that allows them to interpret and translate these stories to us much more than creating them for us. Almost as if they're tapping into or receiving information from some kind of Akashic field of knowledge. We can see hints of this in quotes from four of the most influential fiction writers of our age. J.K. Rowling, author of Harry Potter, the best-selling book series in history, said the idea for Harry just walked into my head. One of the most detailed and well-fleshed-out fantasy worlds we've ever seen just walked into her head. C.S. Lewis, who wrote The Chronicles of Narnia, a fantasy series that ranks second in sales only to Harry Potter, said the story came to me as if from nowhere. George Lucas, who brought us the original world of Star Wars, stated the following in an interview. Paraphrasing, I didn't make up the stories. I channeled them. They came through me. I was just the guy in the right place at the right time to write them down. And maybe the greatest of these, J.R.R. Tolkien, who brought us The Lord of the Rings, said, I have long ceased to invent. I wait till it comes through. Now, I want to credit Into the Wardrobe, another YouTube channel, with partially inspiring this series. His primary focus is unpacking the intricate depths of C.S. Lewis's World of Narnia along with Lewis's other works, and he recently did a great deep dive into connecting the worlds of Middle-earth and Narnia that's definitely worth your time if you're a fan of either or both. I'll have the link down in the description. But while his focus is mainly on faith and the literary richness of those stories, tonight we are asking something a little different. What if these worlds and others aren't just pointing to spiritual truths, but actually remembering physical ones? And while Narnia is certainly on deck, our first episode begins with the man who gave us one of the most complete mythologies ever written, J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien didn't call his work fantasy, at least not in the way we do today. He called it instead a mythology for England, a deep ancient story that felt like it belonged to the very land people walked on. If we look at the prologue to Lord of the Rings, Tolkien reveals an immediate glimpse into his mindset when he says, "The histories of that time are now become legend and myth, and known only to the learned." Then, early in the story, he reiterates the idea through a conversation between Gandalf and Frodo. Gandalf says to Frodo, "The world is not in your books and maps. It's out there. And some things that should not have been forgotten were lost. History became legend. Legend became myth." Right at the outset of the most famous fantasy story ever written, we have the author saying twice that history becomes legend, legend becomes myth. So when Tolkien calls his work Mythology for England, was he really creating it, or was he passing on knowledge from a forgotten age? Let's not forget that through his time at Oxford University, Tolkien had access to texts, manuscripts, and deep lore that weren't available to the general public in his time, and in many cases still aren't today without special permissions. And what did he say in the prologue? Known only to the learned. Tolkien was quite literally one of the learned, just like those he spoke of. As a master linguist, Tolkien gave us some of our finest modern translations of ancient tales like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and Beowulf, among others. And that was just the start. While writing The Lord of the Rings, he introduced us to more than 15 complete languages for his world, including 2 Elvish tongues so deeply developed, people today can actually write poetry and carry on conversations in them. But if we're going to connect the ages of Middle-earth to our current age on Earth as we know it, we need some kind of anchor. Something that's not speculation, but a foundation from the author himself. Thankfully, Tolkien gave us one. A very clear indication about where we today stand in his world. In a late note, he wrote that the year 1960 was in fact year 1960 of the Seventh Age. That's not casual. Tolkien was making a direct correlation to our time and our world. Even more telling, in the same writings, he noted that roughly 16,000 years had passed from the First Age, year of the Sun 310, to the year 1960 AD. Those two solid details give us a mathematical backbone to work backward from while respecting the exact lengths he gave for the Second and Third Ages. That means the Seventh Age, the age we're in right now, began roughly around the time of Christ, give or take. Using that anchor and Tolkien's own numbers for the earlier ages, here's the timeline we built backward. Tolkien gave us exact lengths for the first 3 ages, and he said the latter ones quickened, meaning they got shorter as time moved forward. So we'll use his numbers where he gave them, and for the unknown ages, we'll let each one be roughly 400 years shorter than the one before it while trying to respect the 16,000 year gap. And I'm basing that off the roughly 400-year difference between the Second and Third Ages. Okay, so here's what that looks like. The Seventh Age, 1 AD through today, year 2026 of the Seventh Age as I record this. It's described as an age of men in full control. The magic of the world is gone, giving way to systems and machines. The Sixth Age, 2098 years. From 2098 BC to 1 AD. This is a time of rapid change, early empires, and the last of the fading wonder. The Fifth Age, 2400 years, roughly 4498 to 2098 BC. Here we see the rise of early civilizations and the old powers slipping away. The Fourth Age, 2,800 years, roughly 7298 to 4498 BC. This is the beginning of the Dominion of Men, a time when stories of elves are shifting from history to legend. The Third Age, 3,021 years that we're familiar with, roughly 10,319 to 7,298 BC. Here we have the rise of human kingdoms, great wars, and the last alliance. The Second Age, 3,441 years, roughly 13,760 to 10,319 BC. This is when Númenor rises as a paradise island, grows proud, and ultimately falls. and of course the First Age, 590 years known as the Years of the Sun, roughly 14,350 to 13,760 BC. This is described of a time of awakening for elves and men, along with the rise of great civilizations and wars with Morgoth. Coincidentally, that's right near the end of the last ice age. If we look at the history Tolkien gave us, the First Age ends with a massive cataclysm. The world is broken, lands sink, everything changes. Tolkien describes the sinking of Beleriand, the great western region full of elven kingdoms that's ultimately drowned beneath the sea. This wasn't just some mild flooding. Beleriand encompassed roughly 400,000 square miles. That'd be like the West Coast states, California, Oregon, and Washington, vanishing into the Pacific Ocean. Now, we tie this initial disaster to Meltwater Pulse 1A, around 14,600 to 14,000 BC. One of the most dramatic periods of rapid sea level rise at the end of the last ice age. Entire cultures that lived near the water were wiped out or forced deep inland and even up into the mountains to survive. That lines up almost perfectly with the end of Tolkien's First Age. And in our own history, there are plenty of traditions that speak of lost continents. We can start with Mu, a Pacific continent home to an ancient, enlightened race that fell to Cataclysm. And all that remains now are the islands of Hawaii, Micronesia, and the mysterious Easter Island. At its peak, it was believed to have upwards of 64 million inhabitants and was larger than South America. And here's what's fun. James Churchward, who put forth the theory, says they had advanced knowledge in engineering, astronomy, and magic. There's also Lemuria, another lost land beneath the ocean. It's said to be the cradle of early humanity before it was submerged. From what I've seen based on their location and mythology, it seems like both Lemuria and Mu were the same continent being remembered by different peoples, descendants of those fortunate enough to escape the devastation. We can also look at Mercator's famous 1595 Arctic polar map, which shows long ago the North Pole having 4 large islands, each roughly the size of Greenland, encircling the Great Black Rock, Rupes Nigra, a feature found on dozens of official maps and globes in history. A history since faded into legend and myth. And whether it's Tolkien's Beleriand, Mu, or Lemuria, they share the same story. Continents full of advanced people who fall to their own hubris, and then the sea takes everything. After the flooding of Pulse 1A ended the First Age, the Second Age began with survivors picking up the pieces. In Tolkien's telling, men are given the gift of Númenor, an island paradise far to the west. They're taught by the elves, build great ships, sail the seas, and grow into a powerful seafaring empire. They remember the old world, but through the generations they grow proud, forget the warnings, and end up trying to take immortality by force. In the end, the island sinks beneath the waves. But what if that's not just story? Tolkien made no secret that Númenor was inspired by Atlantis. But what if it's actually another account of Atlantis, found hiding in the secret rooms of Oxford University, and now known only to the learned? In our timeline, the Second Age lines up with the early Holocene. Survivors of the Great Flood start to rebuild with the knowledge they were able to retain. And then there's the seafaring. Tolkien tells us in the Second Age, men became masters of the sea. They explore, they trade, they colonize. In our own timeline, we see the same thing. Neolithic cultures in the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Persian Gulf, they're making boats, crossing water, and spreading ideas. And with all due respect to the Smithsonian's dogmatic worship of isolationism, architectural evidence across the world highly suggests diffusionism, meaning cultures from around the ancient world were either in some form of contact or influenced by a single society. One that may have had to disperse quickly in every direction because of cataclysm. spreading their knowledge and culture to the four corners of the earth. Then, in the late Second Age, around 10,950 BC, disaster strikes, possibly in the form of the Younger Dryas event. A sudden, violent climate flip with comet fragments, massive flooding, and extinctions. Nuclear physicist Richard Firestone theorizes that comet fragments hit or exploded in the atmosphere. Ice sheets melted fast, oceans rose, continents were covered by tsunamis, and much of the great megafauna were destroyed. Something you may have heard of through Graham Hancock's work on ancient civilizations. And in the midst of this chaos, Númenor is finally swallowed by the sea. Plato himself described Atlantis sinking in a single day and night of earthquakes and floods, a history passed down through his own family from the great Solon. While in Sais, Egypt, in the temple of Neith, an ancient wizened priest took Solon aside and personally conveyed the story while also attesting to written accounts preserved in Egyptian temple history. And listen, this was not a small town temple. Neith was responsible for the following. It was the primary sanctuary dedicated to the goddess Neith, who was worshipped as the creator goddess and great mother. As such, it hosted major festivals, rituals, and pilgrimages, including the Feast of Lamps described by Herodotus. While Sais was the capital of Egypt, the temple complex was a prominent state sanctuary. Pharaohs were closely tied to it, with many kings being crowned there and performing ancient ceremonies. Just being associated with the Neith temple literally increased royal legitimacy. The temple also included educational centers for medicine, law, and philosophy. Priests there maintained extensive archives and historical records, and it's also believed to be one of the first schools in history to teach and employ women. In other words, Solon wasn't talking to some random villager. He was a prominent visitor to the temple, speaking with highly educated priests in one of the great centers of knowledge in the ancient world. If these guys said Atlantis existed, they believed it. And if those records existed, perhaps others do as well. Now, right in the shadow of this cataclysm, around 10,500 BC, the immediate survivors begin building their most enduring works, such as laying out the Giza Plateau as an astronomical marker, with the pyramids aligned to Orion's belt and the Sphinx to Leo. Yes, official dates put them around 26 to 2500 BC, but objective researchers argue the Sphinx and its enclosure show water erosion from a much wetter climate thousands of years earlier. That, combined with their celestial alignment, demands an honest reconsideration of the established narrative. And now we find ourselves entering the Third Age, where human kingdoms rise in earnest and the old magic starts to fade. This brings us through the Mesolithic and into the Neolithic Age in our own history, a time when weaponry and travel advance along with human ambition. Tolkien tells us about 3,021 years of human kingdoms rising, wars with dark powers, and great alliances. One of the most astonishing sights from this time is Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Massive carved pillars, T-shaped stones up to 20 feet tall, circles of enclosures built around 9500 BC. These are astronomical markers and memories, not homes and tombs. Built by people we used to think of as simple hunter-gatherers. And if you want a striking parallel to Minas Tirith, I give you Gunung Padang, which is just fun to say. Just like Minas Tirith, the great mountain city in the stone land of Gondor, it appears to have been built by survivors of a fallen advanced civilization. Gunung Padang is a colossal megalithic complex built directly into a mountain, with layered terraces and enormous stone blocks. Some researchers claim its deepest foundations could reach back to the aftermath of the Great Cataclysm, making it one of the oldest monumental structures on the planet. A stone realm of men, preserving knowledge and power long after the old world had been swept away. When I think about the similarities, it feels like we may well have found our Minas Tirith. And even if the location gives you pause, Indonesia, it's fair to point out, is a bit of a drive from England. It shows that in that age, man was capable of building what we might call Gondorian structures. And all of them feel like echoes. Monuments and cities built by people who remembered something older, something lost. As we enter the Fourth Age, it's important to remember that information from the canon begins to become sparse. We know Tolkien says the dominion of men begins in earnest, and the elves become more legend than reality. This takes us out of the Stone Age and into the Chalcolithic or Copper Age. Here we see people continuing to expand the first real cities, forging metals, writing laws, and organizing into kingdoms. Think of the rise of Sumer in Mesopotamia with cities like Uruk, temples on ziggurats reaching toward the sky, and kings claiming divine power. And even here, we find an echo of something much older. The Sumerians themselves talk about a time before their cities, a golden age of divine beings and great floods. Their kings list goes back to rulers who lived incredibly long lives, almost as if they're remembering the Númenorians. The Bible speaks of the long lifespans of antediluvians, humans that lived hundreds of years until the environment and atmosphere drastically changed after a massive earth-rattling event. The Egyptian kings list has similarities as well, and it just feels like different versions of the same memory. But even as men claimed their dominion in the Fourth Age, the world didn't slow down. In fact, it began to quicken, just as Tolkien described. The ages grew shorter, the pace of change faster, and human ambition started to burn brighter than ever. Stepping into the Fifth Age, we can start to see the ages shrink from the quickening. Human ambition explodes as empires rise and fall faster than ever before. We know very little about Middle-earth during this time, but it's mostly a continuation of the same path. Men expanding their power over the world, inventing and advancing in technology, and claiming dominion in earnest. In our own history, this period lines up with the height of the early to Middle Bronze Age. Egypt is rising into its strong Middle Kingdom, reuniting the land and building new monuments on ancient foundations. In Mesopotamia, the third dynasty of Ur collapses, giving way to new powers like the old Assyrian kingdom and the emerging city-states that would soon birth Babylon the Great. Elam in Iran becomes a formidable regional force, while the Minoans on Crete develop sophisticated palace societies and wide-reaching trade networks. This is an age of bronze weapons and tools, expanding trade routes, early writing systems, and growing cities. Human kingdoms are no longer just surviving the aftermath of ancient cataclysms. They're competing, conquering, and leaving their mark on the world. The quickening is clearly underway, and history is condensing into smaller spans. Nowhere is this more apparent so far in our timeline than the Sixth Age. From roughly 2098 BC to around the time of Christ, kingdoms rose and fell. Babylon rises to power, then finally gives way to the Medo-Persians in 539 BC, an event prophesied over 150 years earlier by Isaiah when it was believed to be impossible. He even named the king that did it. We then see the Persian Empire fall to Alexander the Great and the Greeks, and then the Iron Beast of Rome ascending to power around 146 BC. While it still spans hundreds of years, we definitely see the quickening Tolkien spoke of. Tolkien told us the ages quicken. They get shorter as time goes on, and in our timeline, we stay true to that. The early ages are long and mythic, the latter ones compressed into recorded history. And by the time we reach the Seventh Age, starting at 1 AD, we are in the full dominion of men. Magic fades, wonder diminishes, and technology rises in its place. Think about it. For most of the last 2,000 years, stories rooted in our cultural history have treated anything we might call supernatural as something rare and wondrous. People in those stories react as if they're catching a glimpse of the old magic in a world that's otherwise grown barren of enchantment and charm. Healers performing miracles, court wizards practicing sorcery, or legendary blades like Excalibur carrying ancient power, all of them feel like fading echoes of a time when the veil between the ordinary and the extraordinary was much thinner. We even see this fading of open wonder inside the biblical timeline. During the Exodus, miracles were frequent and dramatic, enough that Pharaoh's own magicians could replicate some of them. The supernatural was a part of the landscape. But by Jesus' day, the same kind of act, feeding thousands with almost nothing, caused people to marvel and declare it a miracle. What once felt relatively common had become rare and astonishing, as if that veil between the ordinary and the extraordinary was now thicker. And yet, those same wonders performed by Jesus and later his disciples helped spark the largest faith in the history of the planet. So now here we are in 2026, year 2026 of the 7th Age in our timeline, with AI racing towards something smarter than us, global systems of control emerging, and the old sense of enchantment all but lost. If Tolkien was trying to give us a map of deep time, a way to remember what came before the official history, then maybe the quickening is the point. The world speeds up, the ages shorten, and we lose touch with what we once were. This pattern mirrors what historians William Strauss and Neil Howe called the fourth turning, a roughly 80 to 100 year generational cycle that history seems to repeat with eerie regularity. At its core, the theory says societies move through 4 seasons. Strong people create good times create weak people create bad times, and those bad times create strong people once again. To make it a little more relatable, most people don't know a lot about their great-grandparents. The things they did, the struggles they went through, or maybe most importantly, the values they held. Now, each full cycle ends on a fourth turning, a period of intense crisis, upheaval, and eventual rebirth. These crises tend to arrive every 80 to 100 years, roughly the span of a human's life. And we've seen this pattern play out 3 times just in modern American history. It started with the American Revolution from 1773 to 1794. A new nation searching for liberty forged in rebellion and war. Next came the American Civil War from 1860 to 1865. A brutal struggle that tore the country apart and redefined it. And most recently, the Great Depression and World War II from 1929 to 1946. Economic collapse followed by global conflict that remade the world order. And now, according to the theory, we find ourselves near the end of the fourth such crisis in this sequence. What makes this especially striking is how it connects to Tolkien's ages. If this kind of generational cycle has existed throughout history, then perhaps the earlier ages truly were much longer. If the tales of people living hundreds of years were history before becoming myth. Imagine, if a survivor of one great crisis could have lived for centuries, personally passing down knowledge, wisdom, and warnings from the old world to those who came after, bridging that gap between the generations. That living memory would explain why the early ages in Tolkien's legendarium feels so mythic and deep, while our own current time feels rushed and forgetful. And just as Tolkien described the latter ages quickening and growing shorter, these fourth turning cycles seem to compress history into even more turbulent periods, where the memory of what came before grows faint, institutions weaken, and society must either break or be reborn. Now, notice something interesting. According to the quickening pattern, the 6th age was shorter than the 5th shorter than the 4th, and so on. But the 7th age has now run longer than the 6th. It feels like we're overdue for the next turn, and being overdue for global events isn't fringe. The Earth's magnetic pole flips every few 100,000 years, but it took 780,000 years for this current cycle to begin. And now, the North Magnetic Pole is shocking scientists, moving at over 30 miles per year toward its new home in Siberia, like it's trying to make up for lost time. If we look at supervolcanoes, most erupt on cycles. In the case of Yellowstone, for example, 600,000 years. And we're currently about 40,000 years overdue. And we are also in the midst of an intensifying solar cycle. The sun operates on a roughly 11-year cycle of activity, and right now we're nearing the peak of solar cycle 25. Now, in the past, massive solar flares and coronal mass ejections didn't matter much to humanity. And they might have produced beautiful auroras and disrupted a few telegraph lines not too long ago, but that's about it. And while we don't always get hit by the most powerful of these ejections, it's only a matter of time before we experience another Carrington-level event, a solar storm powerful enough to knock out power grids, disable satellites, wipe out GPS communications, and cause trillions of dollars in damage to our hyper-connected digital world. And the more we interlace our lives with technology before the next event, the more devastating it'll be. Now, I'm not saying the world's about to flip tomorrow. Even Ben Davidson, founder of Space Weather News, who actively teaches preparation for these events and educates people in earnest, believes we're looking more toward 2040 before things start getting crazy. But if Tolkien was onto something with the quickening, then maybe the Seventh Age stretching this long is a sign. A sign that the pattern is about to shift again. As someone born in the 80s who uses BC and AD and still considers Pluto a planet, you may think it was the internet that signaled to my generation we were entering into a new world. But for me at least, it was actually September 11th that changed everything. For younger generations, it was likely 2020 that turned reality on its head. But even more than the signs we see is the feeling that what we know just isn't as secure as it used to be. Like, just maybe, Sinbad did play a genie in the 90s. Look, with AI and quantum computing advancing at breakneck speeds, and these global impact wars and rumors of wars, it's easy to feel like the ground is shaking under us sometimes. But what if Middle-earth wasn't just Tolkien's imagination? What if it was a preserved memory? A mythology that was once legend. A legend that was once history. Now known only to the learned. Speaking to us about the floods, lost continents, fading wonder, and the rise of humans in a world that used to be full of enchantment. Well, I think I can take some hope from a conversation between Gandalf and Frodo. Lamenting that he had to live through such evil times, Frodo says, "I wish it need not have happened in my time." Gandalf replies, "So do I, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us." So if Tolkien is telling us anything, it's not to fear what's approaching, as ages have come and gone throughout history, but rather, prepare for and embrace what we can do in the time we have. And if that time is the ending of the Seventh Age, then remember, we will be the founders of the Eighth. And just think of who may look back one day at our great deeds as legend and myth. I want to thank y'all for stopping by the fire tonight for this first episode of Cloaked Chronicles. It was a lot of fun looking into this subject, and this series really hits to the spirit of this channel. With so much negativity in the world, I think it's more important than ever to relax, detox from the news, and have some fun looking into the unknown. Here at Fireside, the goal is to go on adventures, to ask questions that stimulate philosophical thought, and to hopefully rediscover a piece of that childhood wonder. Quickfires are great because I do like being able to address contemporary stories as they come up, but episodes like these just let us have a little more fun. And to the Tolkien purists, I don't know half of you half as well as I should like, and I like less than half of you half as well as you deserve. So I ask that you have patience with the latitude I took building this connection. My goal was to stay as true to the canon and its spirit as I could. I also want to once again shout out Into the Wardrobe for his episode connecting the worlds of Narnia and Middle-earth. It helped inspire me to go down this rabbit hole, and it's worth checking out his channel. With the close connection of Tolkien and Lewis, Narnia is the next world I'll likely be taking a look at in this series, but if there's others you'd like us to explore, drop those down in the comments. And while a lot of this episode was speculation and conjecture, we did touch on real historical places and events, so as always, do your own research and never sell yourself short. Take care out there, and God bless.